Thank you. I met Peter Duisberg for the first time in person today, but I've seen him very often on video. And there is one clip that has always remained in my mind, and that is where he is wide-eyed in surprise, sheer disbelief at what happened to him after he started to question that HIV was the cause of AIDS. He had all the students he wanted, lab space, grants, elected to the National Academy and so on, could hardly do anything wrong professionally until he started to question HIV as the cause of AIDS. And what happened then, he got no more grants, manuscripts rejected out of hand, no substantive reason given, simply everyone knows that HIV causes AIDS. He's been called dishonest by people like Robert Gallo, responsible for deaths in South Africa, the moral equivalent of a Holocaust denier. The question is, what had he done differently? Nothing. He was doing science exactly as he had always done it, looking at data, giving sources in his publications, giving his analysis, giving his conclusions. So of course he was surprised that he wasn't getting grants and so on anymore. His experience of being sent beyond the pale simply for doing science and publishing, trying to publish his science, is obviously an aberration, because science is not like that. We have peer review, which is impersonal and impartial. Arguments are substantive in science, not ad hominem. So his experience is obviously unique, or perhaps shared only by other AIDS rethinkers. Actually, no. His experience is far from unique. And for example, there's The Skeptical Environmentalist is the title of a book by Bjorn Lomborg, published in 2001 by Cambridge University Press. It deals with a number of environmental issues, amongst them global warming. In the chapter on global warming, which is fully documented, he points out that the Kyoto-type initiatives would reduce the amount of greenhouse effect and global warming so little that we will have to adapt in any case to sea level changes and so on. So it would make much more sense to spend planning, time, effort, and money adapting to the changes that are coming anyway, rather than wasting them in trying to reduce the warming by an infinitesimal amount. Seems like a normal sort of argument. The chair of the International Panel on Climate Change, what's the difference between Lomborg's view on humans and Hitler's? An Australian columnist called climate change denial an offense, it's a crime against humanity. An American environmentalist agreed. There should be war crimes trials for these so-and-sos, a sort of climate Nuremberg. And Nature, in a book review, said the text employs the strategy of those who argue that gay men aren't dying of AIDS and that Jews were not singled out for extermination by the Nazis. So global warming denial is as much beyond the pale as HIV/AIDS denial. But of course, those two issues are things that have tremendous social and political implications, and therefore you're not going to find this sort of situation in a pure science with no obvious practical applications like astronomy or cosmology. Well, you do. Halton Arp, a senior American observational astronomer, found these exciting results. Pairs of quasars physically close together, but with very different redshifts. Aha! Redshifts are not purely Doppler effects. We can't calculate distances just from redshifts. How exciting. We have to rethink the universe origin, the expansion calculations. It may not have started as a Big Bang. Well, you would think that this would excite other astronomers and cosmologists, and it did. They said, Dr. Arp, you're not getting any more telescope time for observations because no one doubts the Big Bang. And in his mid-50s, Halton Arp had to emigrate from the United States in order to continue his work, which he did at the Max Planck Institute. There was a letter to Nature written by 34 senior astronomers who agreed with Arp, people from 10 different countries, names that many people will recognize like Herman Bondi and Tommy Gold, Ghosh, Nalika. And they wrote this, pointed out in this letter, that Big Bang theory relies on a number of entities that have been postulated but never observed, that there are alternative theories that can explain all of the basic phenomena of the cosmos, and yet virtually all financial and experimental resources in cosmology are devoted to Big Bang studies. Well, these are substantive points about a research issue. No reason why it shouldn't be published. Of course, Nature refused to publish the letter. And it was posted on the internet later. Hundreds of additional signatures were added. The letter was later published in New Scientist. Does this remind you of what happened with the group for Rethinking AIDS? There was a mainstream conference on outstanding questions for the standard cosmological model. It did not even consider the question of what these anomalous redshifts are. So the non-Big Bang cosmologists organized their own separate meeting. So for some reason, non-Big Bang cosmology is as much beyond the pale as HIV/AIDS denial or human-caused global warming denial. String theory. Theoretical physicists for decades have wondered how is one going to unify relativity, which deals in theories of continua, with quantum mechanics, which deals with theory for discrete things. And since the mid-1970s, there has been no progress. Everyone has worked on what's called string theory, which turns out not to be a theory. It has not resulted in a single testable conclusion. And there is a book that talks about the landscape of string theories, and that there is an almost infinite number of them, of which one or two they hope may bring up something useful. Nevertheless, theoretical physicists who want to try other approaches will not get grants, they don't get published, they don't get jobs. So you begin to wonder how many situations in science are there where a single theory has taken such control of everything. Well, there's the extinction of the dinosaurs. Everybody knows they were killed off 65 million years ago by an asteroid, except The paleontologists, who are the experts in that area, they don't know it. The theory was developed by Louis Alvarez, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and his son, a geologist. Years before that, a paleontologist, Dewey McLean, had developed a detailed theory based on volcanism, and it had long been known that there had been tremendous volcanic eruptions, the Deccan Traps in the Indian area at about the relevant time. At a conference, Alvarez took McLean aside and said, if you persist in resisting my asteroid hypothesis, I'll wreck your career. And he did, in fact, try to do that when McLean was up for promotion. Lomborg and Arpen McLean and other denialists of mainstream theories. They can't get grants, can't get published. They're compared to Holocaust deniers, and they're just as surprised as Peter Duisberg was, because it isn't supposed to be like that in science. And it wasn't always that way. But nowadays it's cutthroat, and there's a lot of corner cutting and sheer dishonesty in science. There is an Office of Research Integrity, and if Orwell were around, he would be sorry he had not thought of that sort of title. We now have, there's actually a thriving academic industry since the last 2 or 3 decades. There are centers for research ethics. There are journals like Accountability in Research. A lot of people are devoting effort to telling scientists how to behave, because that's what science has come to. Genuine science, simply the search for better understanding, has been hijacked by vested interests and self-interests, and we now have what I call knowledge monopolies and research cartels. And it's a new phenomenon, because Lomborg doesn't know that AIDS denialists are treated like global warming denialists, and Arp doesn't know that AIDS and global warming denialists are treated even worse than those who question the Big Bang, and McLean doesn't know that denialists about AIDS and the Big Bang and global warming also have their careers threatened or destroyed. Everyone who experiences this personally imagines it's a unique experience, because science isn't supposed to be like this, and yet it is nowadays. So you have a single theory in so many fields now that dominates control of grants, jobs, publications, promotions, and so on, and the question is why? And that's not a rhetorical question, because I'm going to tell you in about 10 minutes why that is. And in doing that, I have to survey centuries of modern science. Volumes have been written about this. I can't possibly mention the needed exceptions and nuances which are there, but I assure you that the sweeping generalizations are fully in the mainstream of what history of science and sociology of science, what we now call science studies, what it knows. The traditional view of science had a scientific method that guarantees objectivity. Scientists were working impersonally, interested only in discovering truth, and scientists were somehow different, smarter, more trustworthy, honest, so involved in their work that money and other things didn't matter to them, thinking of icons like Albert Einstein. The reality of modern science is there isn't a scientific method. Actually, there never was a scientific method. Science is done by people, and people tend not to be objective. Scientists nowadays are on the whole, professionals, just like the professionals on Wall Street, for example. And as just one example, if you scan newsletters put out by the National Institutes of Health, you find periodically, quite often, little statements, so-and-so has been barred from seeking grants for a period of 3, 4, 5 years because faking results, plagiarizing in a grant application or something of that sort. Well, modern science started in about the 17th century, and it's credited largely to the work of amateurs. They were often ministers or priests, and there was very little conflict of interest with truth-seeking. They were doing it because they wanted to understand things. And soon voluntary associations formed, the Royal Society of London and other academies. Publications were founded. This was an informal beginning of peer review. In the 19th century, it became possible to have a career as a scientist. It became a profession. You could make your living that way. And that brought in a certain conflict of interest, because if you're involved in making a career, then getting results tends to become very important. But still, it was pretty much an intellectual free market with lots of different people independently looking at any given topic. It wasn't very expensive, so there were a multitude of sources of support, and there was genuine intellectual competition. The big change started in the middle of the 20th century when big science came in, and the icon of that is the Manhattan Project, which created atom bombs. And the popular view then became, after that success, science can do anything if you just give it enough money. And money started to pour in. The National Science Foundation got going. And for a while, and I enjoyed that period in the 60s and early 70s, everyone can get grants. There was enough money to go around. Teachers' colleges converted themselves into research universities because all they had to do was to appoint a few bright faculty members who could get grants, and the overhead on the grants paid for all sorts of infrastructure in the universities. In the United States in the 1940s, there were just over 100 PhD granting universities. By 1978, that number had just about trebled. And with that, there came competition between institutions. Which are the top graduate departments? Which are the top research departments? And of course, the criteria couldn't be human judgment. They had to be objective. How many grants are they getting? How much money are they bringing in? How many papers are they publishing? How many citations are those papers getting? How many students are they graduating? Derek de Sola Price was an early historian of science, and he recognized that there had been an exponential growth of science since about the 17th century. The number of scientific journals, the number of abstract journals, the number of scientists had about doubled every 15 years for something like 2 or 3 centuries. By shortly after World War II, about 2.5% of the gross domestic product was being spent on research and development, and Price pointed out it was impossible to continue the doubling at this rate, and he said there are going to be crises as science tries to adjust from a culture of unlimited growth to a culture of steady state, where if one person gets a grant, There'll be some others who don't get a grant because there just isn't any more money around. And I think the phenomenon of dogmatic knowledge monopolies and research cartels, that's one manifestation of this crisis. John Ziman in Prometheus Bound 1994 has described another aspect of this. More and more scientists, a huge proportion of people who we would call scientists, are actually employees. And their loyalty is not so much to the abstract concept of science searching for truth, but they owe loyalty to their employers. And academic scientists are just as much having to be loyal to those who give them their grants, to their sponsors. It used to be, certainly in the late 19th century, that science would be compared to religion in the good sense that scientists, like monks, were not self-seeking. Nowadays, as I've said, many scientists are like Wall Street entrepreneurs. And what you have, of course, is those who pay the piper call the tune. So research projects are more and more determined by asking for money for what you know money is going to be given. There are fewer sufficiently wealthy patrons to cater for non-mainstream projects. You have bureaucrats making the rules and the decisions, and there are conflicts of interest everywhere. And it's not only individuals who consult and who have personal businesses, there are institutional conflicts of interest with university-industry collaborations. So we have what one might call an academic government-industry complex, and we should credit President Eisenhower for warning us against that. Everyone has heard, I think, of his warning against the military-industrial complex, but Eisenhower also said, in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, we must also be alert to the danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. And that is exactly what the knowledge monopolies and research cartels are. A single theory acts as dogma, and no one knows that anything else exists because the media have to get their sources from the mainstream. If they cover non-mainstream things in a favorable way, their jobs don't last very long. Of course, those of us in this room know that HIV/AIDS theory is wrong and that we have satisfactory explanations for the things that mainstream HIV/AIDS theory can't answer. The lesson that I would like to draw from this is that science itself has become subject to this dogmatic control, and it is whistling in the wind to expect that we can change that situation by scientific arguments. We won't get published. They don't listen to us. I mean, that's the story, that's the experience of a couple of decades. So where will change come from? I would like to think that at some time, some politicians might start to wonder, what have we been getting for $20 billion a year that is being spent on the HIV/AIDS business? I would like to think that at some time, African Americans will begin to rebel against the fact that they are said to be 7 to 20 times as likely to be highly promiscuous, unsafe sex-indulging people, because in every tested group, African Americans test positive 7 to 20 times as often as white Americans, who in their turn test positive in every group just about, 50% more often than Asian Americans. Maybe court cases or a series of court cases might eventually make the big public media pay attention. If we have enough cases like Audrey Serrano's that bring in a few $1 million, although that amount of money is chicken feed for the drug companies, of course. Maybe the media will at some time seize on one or more of these things. But at any rate, the science has been clear for a very long time, and we heard any number of illustrations of that today. There are absolute absurdities that are being swallowed by people and promulgated by people who adhere to the orthodox HIV/AIDS theory. The change has to come from outside science. So I would suggest that our task is somehow in public relations, social activism, somehow getting to create a fuss that the big mass media cannot ignore. Thank you.